Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 3rd of September 2024, 3rd or 4th, depending on where you are in the world. Okay, we'll go straight to the key, just in case you don't know what the lines on my map mean. The yellow lines at the moment, I'm not showing deep state map because I haven't had time to just keep the mapping from deep state map updated. The yellow lines at the moment on here represent the fortifications, usually behind the Russian lines. Okay, we're going to go to the top of the map, to the Kursk area where the Ukrainians have gone across the border, and really the invasion here has slowed down. The amount of territory that the Ukrainians are taking has sort of ground to a minimal at the moment. Indeed, we can see that from this War Mapper statistic. Finally, here's a look at the progression of the Ukrainian advance into Kursk since the operation began. So the control, as you can see, the added territory that they are taking control of has stabilized, slight increase just there, but essentially it's fairly flat compared to the beginning and different sort of time periods along the graph here, along the x-axis. So August the 5th to now, you can see it's really tailed off, I guess, over the last sort of 2 weeks there. So although the mapping here shows some changes and my pins are much more accurate for Andrew Perpetua's ups and downs, the light blue and the light red are Andrew Perpetua's changes. So we have some Ukrainian gains here over by Koronovo, although, you know, there are claims that they've been pushed back a little bit from Koronovo, the Ukrainians, and a bit of a loss north of Koronovo of some territory there. Surat Maps has a much bigger area of land that the Ukrainians have taken control of, but actually I think this is going to be evidence coming in that eventually gets Surat Maps to change the mapping more in line with what Andrew Perpetua already had. So actually, if you see this chunk of land there, you could argue that the Russians probably don't control that, but Surat Maps is very quick to change the mapping when the Russians take new territory, or at least even move into territory. They'll chalk that up to the Russians, but when the Ukrainians take control, they're a lot slower and often, you know, far behind Andrew Perpetua. As you can see, the big area of land here that they disagree on, a big area of land here, difference there actually, where Surat Maps has the Russians controlling more than Andrew Perpetua, but generally in this area Surat Maps is lagging behind Andrew's mapping. There's another couple of small gains here around a town called Borky, just here, just south of just the town of Borky itself. Surat Maps has the Ukrainians now controlling that. Likewise, another settlement over here, just on the eastern side of the Ruskaya Konopelka, the eastern side of the sector, and then a few other places as well. But generally, it's slowed down a lot in Kursk. Now, what can we say about Kursk? There's some interesting stuff coming out. First and foremost, this. So the Kyiv Independent reports tonight, actually, that Ukraine plans to indefinitely hold Kursk Oblast's seized territories, according to Zelensky himself. Ukraine is planning on indefinitely holding the seized territories of Russia's Kursk Oblast as it tries to force Russian President Putin to the negotiating table. That's what Zelensky said in an interview with NBC News aired today. So that's, I think, pretty significant. No Reports has a couple of small areas of gain for the Russians. One is just north of Koronovo, so you've got Koronovo there. Small patch of land gained up in, I guess that's going to be so there's Koronovo, so that's going to be maybe up here or up around here, not quite sure. The mapping's quite different with no reports compared to the other mappers, and also a small area of land just yesterday. Because the other thing to note is that my update is a 4-day update. I haven't updated my map, or at least shared it with you, for 4 days. So all of these changes are 4 days worth of changes, and that's going to be interesting when we look at the east, because actually there is a bit of, although there's a lot of pins there is a bit of stabilization that has gone on the, certainly the Pokrovsk area, in some parts of the Pokrovsk area. But anyway, no reports saying on the east as well, a few gains yesterday, and then today some villages near Pogrebki confirmed under Ukrainian control, but the Russians claim to have taken them, but he's like, there's no proof of that at all. So various claims. Now, what else is worth noting? We'll look at rebuy in a second, but no reports and others have been talking about how the Russian soldiers in Kursk are looting. There's a video here of, it's just bizarre that they would record this, of Russian soldiers breaking into a shop and basically taking stuff. There's another video of Russians here sort of stealing a car, screwdriver in the ignition, typical stuff. I mean, I don't know why they're recording this and putting it on the socials, but yeah, lots of different videos of them doing all sorts of stuff. It reminds me of what the IDF did. So the Israeli Defense Force, got into quite a lot of trouble when they went into Gaza initially, because they were like smashing up shops, taking kids' bicycles, blah blah blah. You got Russian soldiers now doing that in Kursk, and it's so weird because, I mean, it's slightly different from the IDF, because Kursk is Russia's territory, and they're going in and they're looting their own country. It's just really weird. Anyway, Rybar, the very pro-Russian source, says, on the probable course of AFU actions in the Russian border regions against the backdrop of the enemies, that's the Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region and its consolidation in the occupied territory, we cannot rule out the possibility of new incursions in neighbouring regions. In the Belgorod region, attempts by Ukrainian units to cross the state border are reported, but they have all been unsuccessful, even with the involvement of relatively large forces. At first glance, the enemy is focused on driving the Russian armed forces out of the sanitary zone in the Kharkiv region. However, the front line in this area has already stalled since the start of the Russian military operation, and the nature of the fighting has turned positional. Hotter spots remain Vovchansk and Lyobiki, where the AFU periodically carry out attacks. So that's to say, okay, moving on from the Kursk area, there are areas where the Ukrainians are possibly attacking or aiming to attack across the border, and they are still fighting in these two sectors north of the Kharkiv Oblast, but it seems to be fairly positional fighting there, so not a lot of change, if any at all. And then they, I don't know if it's worth going on to talk about the rest. Yeah, talk about different areas like the Bryansk region cannot be written off as a possible target of the enemy's offensive either. There are significantly more forests here, which are convenient for penetrating the border and the border settlements of the Chernihiv region. And the presence of Ichkerian units is observed in this area. The activity of classical reconnaissance groups is highly likely, including with a large number of drones, as strike means deep in the rear. With the availability of repeaters, they will be able to set up ambushes and even remotely mine roads with bridges. Possibility of a full-scale operation to invade the Bryansk region should not be ruled out either. After all, the enemy is no stranger to suicidal operations, they say, like the landings at Kimber and Spit and the creation of the bridgehead in Krinky. So that's reference to the Krinky bridgehead being suicidal. I completely disagree with that. That's how Rybar are going to interpret it. But there are some claims that Kimber and Spit attacks didn't go too well. So Bryansk Oblast is this one here. So claims that they could be attacking north through the Chernihiv Oblast and border, or they could come through the Sumy Oblast into Bryansk. So you got the three: Bryansk, Kursk, Belgorod, and the idea from Rybar is that the options are open for the Ukrainians potentially. However, the most dangerous phenomenon at the moment, they say, is the overconfident attitude in society and the media. Euphoria against the backdrop of the pace of advancement and liberation of the DPR territory should not blind us. The enemy, such as the Ukrainians himself, are in no hurry to leave the Kursk region. Stories about how everything is fine and wonderful and that Ukraine will run out of people by the end of the year and its military production will grind to a halt due to an energy shortage are fraught with disappointment. And as practice shows, this disappointment can be very bloody. Several claims there and other areas mentioned as well for potential attacks for the Ukrainians. I don't know really how much spare capacity the Ukrainians have. Just to remind you, Poltava hit today. Poltava area, the comms, communications training areas building, 6-story building there was hit by a couple of missiles 3 seconds after each other. Iskander ballistic missiles. There claims now that 51 have died, 280 odd injured. Huge issue there. And that is, I mean, there are rumours that people might have been on parade, but then I've been watching some interviews of people who were there, news got there fairly quickly, and some of the soldiers are saying, no, we just started our lessons type things, and then they hit. I'd gone outside for a smoke, blah, blah, blah. There were people milling around. It doesn't seem like there were parades. There's a lot of anger. There's going to be misinformation coming out, and no doubt the Russians will be flooding the information spaces with stuff that's going to be divisive for the Ukrainians. So be warned on what you believe, but not to say that that's not what happened, but just take everything with a bit of a pinch of salt. Right, then remember 4 days worth of changes here. Some claims from Syriac Maps that just make sure I finished all of my Kursk segments. Actually, something that is worth mentioning regarding Kursk, this is almost not really a frontline update thing, but it does pertain to Kursk. So I will go through it. This is Artur Rehi, the YouTuber, it's a thread from him. The FSB has allowed the largest data leak. It's not just about the electronic documents that were published by Important Stories, that's a Russian media source, and Ukrainian Truth, but the Ukrainian side has also gotten its hands on documentation of all Russian structures in the Kursk region. The fleeing Russians left everything behind, including top secret documents. According to the leadership, they were supposed to burn the most sensitive documents to prevent them from leaking, but they didn't. Most of the documents were handed over to the journalist Dmytro Karpenko, who is publishing them in parts of them on his Telegram and YouTube channels. What's more interesting is not the facts associated with them, but the lies they contain. The Russian leadership has long relied on the FSB, just as the USSR relied on the NKVD and the KGB, and everything before and after. The security forces have always served as the main lever of influence on both the people and the intra-party relations. Throughout the years of their existence in Russia, the security agencies, in order to justify their existence, their work, and usefulness, are constantly busy looking for external and internal enemies. The atmosphere of paranoia in these structures is a fundamental driving force. The documents obtained reveal the network of lies on the FSB and how it spreads from the very bottom of the chain, from the officer's report to the very top of Putin's desk. Agent messages, questionnaires of recruited agents, denunciations and reports. They're all united by a common tendency to lie to those who prepared these documents. In an attempt to get a medal or a prize for uncovering a secret train of foreign agents, FSB officers conduct investigative activities, creating the appearance of vigorous activity. However, relying on the false reports of the special services, Putin at some point decided that he would be met with flowers in Ukraine. Remember this whole Sims games instead of Sims cards, as I wrote an article on this using that picture and many others from these scenes. It's really bizarre. FSB tried to create this false kind of espionage incident. Anyway, Putin really believes the information that is reported to him up the chain. Now, this is so fascinating because I talk about this all the time. How much does Putin really know? Is he making these decisions to attack in the war starting at the beginning of 2022, was it garbage in, garbage out? Is he making these decisions based on really faulty evidence? He believes in anti-Russian conspiracies of the Anglo-Saxons and the incredible successes of Russia, crucified boys, NATO mercenaries, and other nonsense, because that is what the FSB agent networks report to him. Thus, one of the reports said that Ukraine is recruiting children under 16 and pensioners over 65 into its volunteer units in order to later present them as victims of the conflict. The training of these units is conducted by an English-speaking instructor from Wales, schools. Another agent wrote about the Azov children's camps, the atmosphere of paranoia, and the main feature of the FSB. A normal, healthy person could never work in the Russian security services. They recruit a certain type of people. If there is no external or internal enemy, there is no point in the security forces. Therefore, they invent one for themselves and take him into development, writing crazy reports based on which Putin runs the country. He seriously believes in hordes of neo-Nazis marching through Ukrainian cities. Secret NATO biolabs and conspiracy theories. Based on these reports, Putin did not expect to encounter resistance in Ukraine and did not know the real state of the army. He probably does not know the real state of his nuclear forces either. So that is fascinating, and that's all been found out because Kursk has seen the Russians, retreat from these areas without burning documentation. There's been claims that the Ukrainians have got hold of recruitment files and the names of people who refuse to actually be mobilized and whatnot, and they kind of burnt them so the Russians can't get a hold of them again because they are just paper documents and not kept on computer files supposedly, so helping out those who are refusing to fight for the Russians. Anyway, I digress. So now when we come on to the northeastern sector axis from Kupiansk to Svatove to Crimea, we can see that the Russians have made some small gains as according to Surat maps, but not according to Andrew Perpetua in the Sinkivka settlement, taking control over most of the settlement, again, as according to Surat maps alone. Okay, a little bit further down, we have the Russians making some gains down in this area here. That's Andrew Perpetua coming to agree with what Surat maps had previously said. A little gain for Surat maps there. But the Ukrainians making a few gains in Tabaivka. In fact, I think if we look at Surat maps' individual tweets on these areas, we can pop into that because, I mean, as you can see, there are heaps of these. This is the one, Tabaivka. So, the situation northeastern front, Russian army made new advances northwest of Pischany. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army recaptured new areas in the western elevations of Tabaivka. So, a bit of push and shove in a few areas, but the Russians mainly making gains, though. South of Pischany, this area here on the way to Berestova, the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back. And likewise, around here, both mappers have some gains for the Russians around Stelmakivka, to the north of Stelmakivka, and the settlement itself. Surat maps was ahead of the game, as in made the earlier claims, even though they're often not correct at the time they make them. The Russians do have a habit of going again and again and again until they do actually take whatever they're aiming for. And so often you see, specifically with Russian attacks, Surat maps marking them as Russian controlled, then Andrew Perpetua coming along later and saying, okay, there is requisite evidence there now to support those claims. So here we have Stelmakivka under Russian control, and that is certainly a worry. No change over the last 4 days along the rest of that northeastern sector, which is good news. Surat maps does claim that in the Belahorivka area just south of the Serebryansky forest, that the Russians are actually having some success on the edges of these sort of hilly mountainous areas. Now, if that is true, that is a real worry. This is a very difficult place for the Russians to take. So the Ukrainians have been in this mountainous area. You look down on Belahorivka, which is then, this is all a bit of a kind of a valley here, or low ground between higher ground that the Russians have and higher ground that the Ukrainians have. This is mountainous area, very difficult for the Russians to take. And you've got then this massive chalk pit here that has a kind of a ridge, or almost like a mini sort of ridge going along here, and higher ground here as well. So that's again flat between higher ground and higher ground. It's very difficult for the Russians to take these areas without losing a lot of personnel and equipment, but also it's just geographically very difficult. Now, if we look at this in 3D, you'll see what I'm talking about. So if they're coming from the north, so that's this direction, they'll have to try and get across the Seversky Donetsk River. Now, you can't do that with equipment. This is a one-to-one representation of the terrain here. So the Russians are going to really struggle to try and take these mountains from across the river. So they're going to have to come from the other direction. But as you can see, they're coming from the high ground over here. Then they have to negotiate up here. Now, supposedly they do control some of that area, but trying to get across this flat ground and then up these mountains, these are actually quite a bit higher than it looks on this map. This is like proper sort of, it's not just undulating hills. This is quite difficult terrain. Now, it's interesting that as according to Surrey maps, they have started moving up this hillside here or mountainside or whatever you want to call it, and they're having some success on the outer extremities of where the Ukrainians have long controlled. So if that's true, that's a real worry. But it might not be true. It might have been an attempted attack, but they haven't quite taken control. I don't know. That's often the case with the early mapping changes for Surat map. So that whole area there might or might not be under Russian control. Then as we come further to the south, there are some gains around Vimka, where the Russians have been moving slowly up this railway line. They've now taken some more over the last 4 days, some more land there. No more news from Ivano Derivka. Big difference there between the mappers, and in fact, big difference along this whole railway line between the mappers there. So make of that what you will. Then we have an interesting difference here between Andrew Perpetua and Surat maps, with Andrew Perpetua saying the Russians control a bit more north of Rostelivka, but not where Surat maps has it. They have, I think, something like 35% of Priorizne is the claim from Surat maps under the Russian control. So that's a new bit of gain for the Russians, according to them. Remember, all over the last 4 days. Then we have a few changes to, I don't know why that blue pin's there. That's random. That's not supposed to be there. Then we have some change to Chaziv Yar, as again, according to Surat maps. So here we have the claim that during the last weekend, the Russian army crossed the canal and captured the first trenches of the western part of Kalinivka. In addition, Russian forces made small advances along Chkalova Street in the Zhovnevyi district. Okay, so that is Kalinivka is this area here, Kalinina as it's transcribed on the Google Earth map here. So the Russians had taken control of this some time ago, but they've struggled to get serious purchase across the canal, at least according to Andrew Perpetua. Surat maps has them now controlling some trenches and land to the west of the canal, and further gains of basically this block there in Chaziv Yar. But again, difference between the two mappers there is pretty important, because Andrew Perpetua still has the Russians mainly across the canal, and this is a grey zone. You might have attacks into there. Do they have sustained control? That's another question. Now, it would be worrying if the Russians do have this amount of Chaziv Yar under their control. We shall see, I guess. Okay, coming further down south from there, this is where it's somewhat stabilized. So there's been no change to New York, for example, in the last 4 days. Not a lot of change to Toretsk, which is really good news. Now, there are claims that there are some reinforcements in the general Pokrovsk region for the Ukrainians, and they could well have stabilized the Karadag group, the National Guard, 2,000 troops of theirs. So just going back, actually, there were some attacks in Chaziv Yar that are caught on camera as well, with 3 Russian MTLBs and 1 BMP destroyed. So working in coordination with artillery and infantry from neighbouring units, they were able to halt a Russian assault attempt on the city of Chaziv Yar. And that could be an example of where Surat map says, oh look, there are Russian vehicles and music. Russian vehicles travelling into Chaziv Yar, therefore the Russians control that. But anyway, repelled, as according to that footage. Now, anyway, to where I probably was, The Russians have an order to take Pokrovsk apparently by October the 1st. So the assaults on our positions in Seledovo do not stop. Our guys have set up defences. The enemies cannot develop success. It does not smell like easy take of Seledovo or Seledovo at all, says the lieutenant of the Ukrainians, call sign Alex. Okay, so that's interesting. So it's fairly stable in Tourette's compared to what it was. No changes to Andrew Perpetua. 4 days worth of changes for Surat maps indicates that that area and just a small amount of land here. So not the sort of rates that they were used to in the previous couple of weeks. So that's good news for the Ukrainians. So what's interesting is no change over the last 4 days to this whole area of the Pokrovsk region. So that's going towards the T0504 highway. That's going towards Pokrovsk itself. They're having better success coming down to the south. Now, we just heard about Seledovo, which is this area where the Ukrainians were being pushed back and the Russians very quickly took quite a large amount of it. They moved through Mykolaiivka. They had a really easy time. The Russians have taken Novohorodivka. Basically, the Ukrainians just gave that up. But it looks like the Ukrainians are now putting up some defense in Seledovo and not making it easy for the Russians. Now, where there was the most amount of gain over the last 4 days, remember this is 4 days worth, if you draw an imaginary line connecting all of these light pink sort of pins there, that's where Andrew Perpetua had the Russian defensive line. Okay, so that's where it was, and in 4 days they've taken all of this land. So relatively easy for them to have taken out. I say easy as in the amount of territory they took in 4 days is much more than we've seen along most of the rest of the war, particularly in places like Bakhmut and, well, pretty much most of the eastern front line. It's only now that they're gathering this kind of pace in some of their attacks. Surat Maps has slightly less amount of land being taken the last 4 days, but that's because they already had some of this under Russian control anyway. But it actually goes further. You can see there's a big difference between the red line here of Surat Maps and the blue line of Andrew Perpetua. So there's a difference of who controls what in this area. This is what Surat Maps has. This is what the Russians have taken basically in the last 4 days, all of that land, and that's the difference between the two mappers. So this is the main area of gain for the Russians across the whole of the front line in the last 4 days. But the good news is there is a lot of stabilization to other areas of the Pokrovsk region. It's interesting that they've been tasked with taking Pokrovsk by October the 1st, apparently. ISW reports that the Ukrainian armed forces have regained part of their positions near Pokrovsk. So geolocation from September the 2nd showed Ukrainian forces regaining positions southwest of Novohorodivka. So southwest, this is, remember, Novohorodivka. Southwest is going to be somewhere around here, possibly. Could be in Seledovo area, not really sure. I haven't checked the footnotes for that one. But yes, so geolocation shows that's good news. Ukrainian forces have regained lost positions southeast of Pokrovsk amid ongoing Russian tactical actions in the area, analysts said. So more evidence that the Ukrainians have possibly got reinforcements in the area. 79th Brigade has discovered a Russian column near Novomykolaiivka. So when we come further down south from here, we see that Herivka, west of Mariinka, has seen no change. 4 days has seen just a small area, basically a field south of Krasnohorivka, come under Russian control according to Surat Maps. When we come down south of Mariinka towards Pobyeda, we have some small Russian gains there. It's sad to see Pobyeda, firmly in the hands of the Russians, and then likewise Novelska, just up here, that held out for so long for the Ukrainians. This agricultural settlement that was really well fortified. But interesting that Andrew Perpetua has that still in the grey zone there. Nevertheless, those two. I spent so many weeks and months talking about those two settlements, and now they appear to be, Russian controlled, at least somewhat. Now, when we look at Novomykhailivka, we can see that the Ukrainians are being pushed back north of the next settlement. It's Paraskevivka and then Konstantinivka. Konstantinivka in either entirely under Russian control, as according to Surat maps, or about half under Russian control, as according to Andrew Perpetua. North of there, some gains for the Russians, as according to, as mentioned, Surat maps. Now, there is quite a bit of footage coming out from here. Destroyed column, or a repelled column, destruction of a number of vehicles in one bit of footage that you can see. I mean, unfortunately, I can't play this stuff to you because YouTube doesn't like it. But there's a lot of activity around here. Ukrainians are still attriting the Russian forces. The Russians are being made to pay for their advances, but they don't ever seem to be particularly worried about that. And they are marching on regardless, particularly down in this Vodyane area and Vuhledar. Vuhledar looks like it's being sort of flanked. You've got a mine here just northwest or northeast, sorry, of Vuhledar that the Ukrainians are fighting over at the moment. The Russians have got some purchase in there according to Surat maps, and they have taken control over quite a lot of this highway, as according again to Surat maps. Andrew Perpetua is slightly less charitable, but I imagine that would be forthcoming anyway. And then also, this is bad. Bit of bad news for the Ukrainians is that the Russians have had some successful attacks around the Preshchivsk. Let's have a go at this. Preshchivka, taking control over much of that settlement and pushing, considerably to the west from where they were. So Andrew Perpetua had them at Pavlivka, just outside Pavlivka. All of this land is now taken. That's 4 days worth of gains for the Russians there. Surat maps has them taking slightly less because they had them already much further on than Andrew Perpetua. So nonetheless, both mappers having the Russians taking some serious territory there in that southern area. As you can see here, Surat map says the situation southwest of Donetsk. Russian army began the operation to capture the locality of Vuhledar by advancing from 2 axes. On the first axis, Russian forces entered in the South Donbassian mine, which is currently contested. Meanwhile, on the second axis, Russian troops advanced north of Novomyolsk, west of Pavlivka, reaching the first buildings of Prechivstivka, where clashes with the Ukrainian army are taking place. Lots of fighting there. If you go to my ATP Geopolitics Distilled, you can find, this is it, the website is linked in all of my descriptions. You can find the synopses of all of my videos in case you can't watch them. You can read them. AI has transcribed them and sifted, turned them into these chaptered summaries, which are really, really useful. So you can go and check that out. But I'm just going to pop into something else that's been done by Benny Pie. It's been really, really useful here, which is the ISW Daily Report Summary, and just really condenses it even further into really useful bullet points. But yeah, Russian forces regained lost positions east of Koronovo and Kursk Oblast. So you can get a sense of what's going on in all of these places in sort of 1 or 2 sentences, with some additional points of note. For example, today's one is Russia has reportedly completed testing of a new glide bomb, which will soon be fielded by its bomber aviation regiments, and other bits and pieces and anecdotes and whatnot. So anyway, yeah, that's the Frontline update for today. Sorry, I'm a bit all over the place. I have done an awful lot of content today and my brain is absolute mush. But there you go. So time for some sleep for me. But that is it. 4 days worth of gains. I'll try and keep on top of this on a daily basis from now on. Now that my boys are back at school and my working day is much more open to doing mapping, but I can't promise anything there. It looks bad for Ukraine, but actually that's 4 days worth, and I think it's probably slowed down a little bit in terms of what the Russians are taking. There has been some stabilization, but it is still very worrying. And of course, the Ukrainians have are now coming across a lot more resistance up in Kursk, as the Russians are at least somewhat getting their act together, even though there are many claims, anecdotal from the Russians, that it's all, and the Ukrainians, that it's all pretty chaotic for the Russian defences up there. But there must be enough troops and equipment in place to keep the Ukrainians largely in check. Anyway, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.